The history of science needs a god, a solitary genius, a lone mind that touched the face of the universe and came back changed. It needs this story because the alternative is too complicated, too political, too deeply inconvenient for the institutions that built their reputations on the official version. The alternative involves a woman with a sharper mathematical mind than the man whose name we remember. A woman whose handwriting appears in the preparatory notes. A woman whose name should appear on the papers and does not. In 1905, the world celebrated the Annus Mirabilis, the miraculous year in which an obscure Swiss patent clerk published 4 papers that rewrote the laws of physics and redefined our understanding of space, time, matter, and light. The myth was clean. The myth was beautiful. The myth was a man working alone in the white fire of pure solitary intellect. But the official archives, if you read them with enough care and without the reverence the myth demands, contain a different story entirely. They contain letters written in Einstein's own hand, addressed to the woman he was in the process of erasing, using a word that solitary geniuses do not use. The word is our research, our work on relative motion, our solution to the problem of electrodynamics. When a man working entirely alone writes to the woman he loves, he does not describe his independent scientific work as ours across multiple letters, spanning multiple years, unless that word reflects something true about the origin of the work. The official history decided that word was metaphor. We are here to suggest it was not. Welcome back to Medusa Awakened, where we unearth the voices they tried to bury. Her name was Mileva Marić. She was born in 1875 in Tadel, in what is now Serbia, into a family that recognized before the world was prepared to that their daughter possessed something exceptional. Her father obtained special dispensation from the Minister of Education for her to attend the all-male Royal Classical High School in Zagreb. She was the only girl in her class. This was not a minor social irregularity. This was a structural defiance of the entire intellectual architecture of the late 19th century, which had spent considerable academic energy constructing biological arguments for why the female brain was constitutionally incapable of abstract reasoning, why mathematics was male in its essence, why the presence of women in scientific institutions would destabilize both the women and the science. Mileva Marić dismantled those arguments without engaging them. She simply excelled. In 1896, she enrolled in the mathematics and physics teaching section of the Swiss Federal Polytechnic in Zurich, the institution now known as ETH Zurich. She was the only woman in her cohort. 5 students entered that program. One of them was a young man named Albert Einstein, who was intuitive, intellectually bold, charismatic, and profoundly resistant to the disciplined, systematic mathematical work that theoretical physics requires at the level of publication. He skipped lectures. He relied on the notes of others. He was, by multiple accounts including his own, not a rigorous mathematician. Mileva Marić was. She was precise, methodical, and possessed of the kind of mathematical patience that transforms physical intuition into equations that hold under scrutiny. From the earliest weeks of their acquaintance, Einstein depended on her intellectual infrastructure to remain academically functional. Their relationship began as an alliance between 2 people who understood that they perceived the world differently from everyone around them. He provided the physical intuition, the audacious conceptual leaps that redefined what questions were worth asking. She provided the mathematics. In theoretical physics, the mathematics is not decoration or supporting documentation. The mathematics is the proof. The mathematics is the argument. Without it, an idea is speculation. With it, an idea becomes law. Between 1901 and 1905, something happened in shared apartments in Zurich and Bern that the history of physics has never fully confronted. Mileva Marić and Albert Einstein were working together. Not as supervisor and student, not as genius and assistant, not as creator and support staff, as collaborators. The evidence for this is in the letters. It is in Einstein's own words, written to Mileva during periods of separation, describing the scientific work they are doing together, and using the first-person plural with a consistency that cannot be explained as romantic metaphor. Our research into electrodynamics, our paper on relative motion, our work. The 4 papers of 1905 were published under one name, Albert Einstein. Mileva Marić appears on none of them. She had failed her Polytechnic final examination twice, and the official biographical tradition uses this failure as evidence of intellectual limitation. What the official biographical tradition does not foreground is that her second examination attempt took place while she was pregnant, unmarried, carrying the child of the man whose papers she was helping to produce. In a society that treated unmarried pregnant women as moral catastrophes rather than human beings operating under extraordinary pressure, she sat her examination in that condition, failed it, gave birth to a daughter named Liesel, who vanished from the historical record entirely, likely given up for adoption or dead in infancy, and then continued working. The Serbian biographer Desanka Trbuhović-Gurić, writing in 1969, was the first scholar to systematically argue that Mileva's contribution to the 1905 papers was substantial and deliberate. Then came the fuller correspondence, and then it became clear that certain letters were absent from the archive in ways that could not be explained by ordinary archival loss. As Einstein's fame grew, Mileva's world contracted with the precise inverse logic of a system designed to produce exactly this outcome. He became an international scientific celebrity, moving between prestigious professorships, receiving honors, corresponding with heads of state and the leading intellects of the century. She managed the household. She raised their sons Hans Albert and Eduard. She watched the intellectual partnership that had defined her adult life transform, without announcement or acknowledgement, into a domestic arrangement that recognized no prior collaboration and offered no future recognition. In 1914, Einstein accepted a prestigious professorship in Berlin and presented Mileva with a document before she agreed to accompany him. It was not an expression of partnership or affection. It was a list of conditions, written down, explicit, numbered, produced with the calm confidence of a man who understood that the scientific establishment would continue to celebrate him regardless of the private terms on which he operated. At home, the document required Mileva to keep his clothes and laundry in order, to serve him 3 meals a day in his study, to renounce all personal relations with him, to expect no intimacy or affection in any form, to stop talking immediately when he requested silence, and to leave his room without protest when instructed. This is a document written by a man to the woman who had been his intellectual collaborator, his mathematical infrastructure, the mother of his living children, a woman with a university-level scientific education at a moment in history when almost no women on Earth had access to such a thing. He reduced her, in writing, to a domestic servant whose compliance he could secure by listing his requirements explicitly. Mileva did not sign. She returned to Zurich with their sons. The academic world that celebrated him noticed nothing, because the academic world had already decided that what happened in domestic spaces was not its concern. If you believe history has been engineered to produce lone male gods while erasing the women who built the altars they stand on, subscribe to Medusa Awakened. Let's rewrite the narrative together. The divorce was finalized in 1919. It contained a clause that historians have examined ever since. Einstein promised Mileva the money from the Nobel Prize. Not money he currently possessed. Money from a prize that had not yet been awarded, from a committee that had not yet voted, for work whose canonical primacy he was sufficiently certain of, to use as a financial instrument in a legal settlement. When the Nobel Prize arrived in 1921, the money went to Mileva as agreed. She used it to purchase 3 apartment buildings in Zurich. She spent the years that followed watching that security erode as the financial and psychological demands of caring for Eduard, who had developed schizophrenia in his early 20s, consumed what she had built. She cared for him across decades, moving between institutions and rented rooms, managing his illness on the resources of a woman who had received financial compensation in lieu of recognition and money in place of her name on the work. She died in 1948 in Zurich, alone in her apartment following a stroke. After her death, the people who came to settle her affairs found a sum of money concealed inside her mattress. It was nearly all she had left of the settlement she had received almost 30 years earlier. The official biographers who constructed Einstein's legacy in the decades following his death portrayed Mileva as a woman undone by jealousy and depression, a difficult personality, an obstacle to a great man's creative happiness, and therefore, by that framing's own logic, to the advancement of science. Her letters were not systematically published until the 1980s and 1990s. When the Einstein Papers project released that correspondence, it revealed a woman of intellectual precision and warmth. A woman whose voice had been present in the work from the beginning, and whose absence from the published record was not a consequence of incapacity. It was a decision made by people who understood exactly what that decision meant. The world knows the equation. Every educated person on Earth knows E equals mc squared. Very few of them have been told the full account of how it was built, and by whom, and under what conditions. Mileva Marić provided the mathematical architecture that transformed Einstein's physical intuitions into publishable, verifiable, peer-reviewable science. And her name appeared on none of the papers, none of the prizes, none of the monuments, and none of the textbooks that built the modern physics curriculum. She died with concealed money in a mattress, a son in a psychiatric institution, and a name that existed in the official history only in footnotes written by people who had already decided what her role had been. But the mathematics does not respond to footnotes or to institutional decisions about whose name belongs above the work. The equations are true, regardless of how the credit was distributed. The framework holds whether or not the people who constructed it were acknowledged. And every time we use that framework to understand the universe, to calibrate satellites, to make the calculations that modern technology depends on, we are using something that was built by two minds working together in a shared apartment in Zurich, before one of those minds decided that the other had become inconvenient to the myth he was becoming. Her name was Mileva Marić. The history of physics spent a century learning not to say it. We are saying it now, and we are not stopping. Her name was Mileva Marić. She helped build the architecture of modern physics. They erased her from the equations. The equations remain.